once again, happy Father's Day to those of us who are fathers in the room. If you have a Bible, or if you'd like to, on your phone or whatever, we're going to be in the book of 1 Samuel this morning. We're going to talk on the idea of legacy. Last week, starting our short two-part Father's Day service series, we talked about owning it and how we learned from the 7 sons of Sceva that if you don't really own your faith, you don't really have the faith that you're declaring. And you can't just have the faith because your parents had the faith. It's got to be something that's been bred inside of you, that's been brooding inside of you for eons, if maybe eons is too long, but you know what I mean. It's got to be something that's growing inside of you, bearing fruit. It can't just be, I'm going to walk this walk of faith because, as I said, my grandmother and my great aunt did it. It's got to be something for you because it's in you and it's God sprung. And so today we're going to kind of take the same look, but we're going to talk about the idea of legacy, because in 1 Samuel we're going to look at a gentleman who we might all know. He's the high priest of Israel at the time, and we're going to look at how in his life and the things that he did or didn't do kind of bred a generation of people who were similar. And the idea of legacy, do we want to leave a legacy that's godly? Do we want to leave a legacy that is one that is pursuing God, like our song said? I want you more than anything, more than any other. Is it the idea that nothing quenches the thirst inside of us quite like the Spirit of God? Or are we leaving a legacy of, well, faith is just some flippant thing we do. It's just, it's not really who we are. It's more so like what we do, and it doesn't really have any bearing on our lives. What kind of legacy are we wanting to leave behind? And so, like always, this is not father dominant, because I believe that these principles and the talk today can be geared towards anyone. So our story begins in 1 Samuel chapter 2, starting in verse 12. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the story, our story is regarding the high priest Eli. Eli is the high priest that is found in the first few chapters of 1 Samuel. He has the dubious distinction of thinking that one of his churchgoers was a drunkard. Hannah, on one of the Jewish festivals, comes into the temple with her husband Elkanah, and he has another wife, and that wife has many children, and Hannah is unable to give birth for some odd reason, and so she's at the temple praying to God, but she's like most of us. She's praying in her heart, her lips are moving, but no words are coming out, and Eli, being the weird high priest that he is, says, "Hey, you drunkard, get out of here, you shouldn't be in church." And she says to him, "I'm not drunk, my heart is so hurt, and I'm pleading to God so badly that I don't have words to say." And then he's like, "Oh, well, okay, because you're not drunk, well then may God grant you your desire." And she is the mother of Samuel, and she vowed to God that if she would be able to bear a child, she would dedicate this son to the Lord. And so then we have chapter 1 and the beginning of, chapter 3, we have the story of Samuel and Eli, where God calls out to Samuel, and he runs to Eli, and Eli is like completely unawares as to what's going on, and God calls out to Samuel, and Samuel becomes this great prophet of God through his lifetime. But in chapter 2, we're going to see a story that isn't really familiar to a lot of church people. So that's why I like it, and that's why I picked it, because I think it's a really important story. So 1 Samuel chapter 2, starting in verse 12, says that Eli's sons, so we're just right off the hop told that Eli has children, but his sons are wicked men, and they do not respect the Lord. Not only that, they don't respect the priest's share of the sacrifices from the people. When anyone offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged meat fork while the meat was boiling, and they would plunge it into the container, kettle, cauldron, or cooking pot. The priest would claim for himself whatever the meat fork would bring up. This is the way they treated all the Israelites who came there to Shiloh. Now you have to understand, in those days, there was a lot of procedure. You didn't just come to church. You had to come to church with an offering. You had to come to church with a grain offering, a meat offering, a wave offering, an oil offering, a thanks offering, a peace offering. You had to come to church with all these different things at specific times of the year. And at certain times you had to come to God with a burnt offering. And you had to have meat. More often than not, it was already pre-butchered. And you would bring it into the temple or the tabernacle. And they would boil it. And then after it was boiled, they would separate it. Some would go back to you, some would go to the priest, and others would go on the big altar outside in the courtyard, and they would burn them, hence burnt offerings, and they would burn that meat, and the aroma would go up as a pleasing aroma unto God. Now, Eli's kids aren't following procedure. While the meat is boiling, they take their 3-pronged meat fork and they stab it into the boiling pot, and whatever would come up out of the pot with their meat fork, they would take for themselves. Thus, really demeaning the practices of God and also demeaning the people, because then these people wanting to offer their offerings to God weren't allowed to because the priest's children were stealing it from them. So it says that even before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the one who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast, because he won't accept boiled meat from you, only raw." So here it's almost as if, like, we almost see that even they were arguing beforehand. Before I even put it in the boiling pot, I want the raw meat. I want to cook it the way I want to. Some people argue that they were actually then selling it because they couldn't sell boiled meat, and they knew the price of raw meat was better, so the priests were stealing raw meat from the people coming to church and then selling it for a profit and pocketing all the proceeds for themselves. Either way you look at it, this is a very derelict thing for a minister, a man of God, to be doing. Something that I wish wouldn't happen, but unfortunately, according to Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun, and it's still happening. But in this case, we see these sons of the high priest, priests unto God, are stealing from the people giving their sacrifices. And it says that if the person giving the sacrifice said to the priest, "The fat must be burned first, then you can take whatever you want for yourself," the servant would reply, "No, I insist that you hand it over right now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." Could you imagine coming to church and I'm standing there at the back? "Hand it over. If you don't give, I'm going to take it by force." As you're opening the door, you see some of our congregants rolling down the stairs as I push them down the stairs to take their offering by force. This is kind of the story that I'm reading. They're so against the things of God, even though they're in the house of God, they're violently taking what they want from the people. And their father is the high priest. So the servant's sin was very severe in the presence of the Lord, because the men treated the Lord's offering with contempt. Now if we skip down to verse 22, it says, "Now Eli was very old." As if like that's the excuse. He's so old, just... He heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they were sleeping with women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. It just keeps getting worse. He said to them, "Why are you doing these things? I have heard about your evil actions from all these people. So why aren't you doing anything about it then? You're the high priest. You should be doing something." "No, my sons, the news I hear the Lord's people spreading is not good. It's not good. If one person sins against another, God can intercede for him. But if a person sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him?" But they would not listen to their father. And the author of Samuel says that it's because the Lord intended to kill them. Now, please don't read into that as if the Lord was going to strike them down like the god Zeus from the Greek mythology. God is not in the business of executing people. God is in the business of blessing or cursing, as Deuteronomy says. And the way that works is, God told the nation of Israel, if you follow me and do what I command, you'll be blessed. If you stray from my commands and do what you want and do what the world wants, you'll be cursed. And so this is all to say that Eli's kids were doing evil in the eyes of God. Therefore, they will be killed. Somehow, some way. But not that God is going to kill them. So a man of God comes to Eli and said to him, this is what the Lord says. Didn't I reveal myself to your forefathers' family when they were in Egypt and belonged to Pharaoh's palace? Out of all the tribes of Israel, I chose your house to be my priests, to offer sacrifice on my altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod in my presence. I also gave your forefathers' family all the Israelite food offerings. Why then do all of you despise my sacrifices and offerings that I require at the place of worship? You, Eli, have honored your sons more than me by making yourselves fat with the best part of all the offerings of my people Israel. So it's not a great story, as you can tell. Eli's sons are not what you would expect for ministers in the house of God. But really, nor is Eli. And Eli is the main focus of our story. In reading this past week, I found some things that could relate to a lot of us in the way we leave legacy and how we deal with things. Coming from the story of Eli, it's fatherly focused, but I think it works regardless of how we live our lives, because we are all people of influence. No matter where we live, no matter what we do, we all have others that are in our realm of influence. And so the first thing I want to share with you is that in our story we see that Eli ignored the spiritual growth of his children. Now, you can argue, I know some of us don't have kids in this place and others have kids, and some of us have kids that are in church and others don't have kids that are in church. But the whole point I want to not argue is the idea that it doesn't matter whether you have kids or not. You can ignore the spiritual growth of the people you know. And so the point of legacy is, what are you doing with the knowledge that you have with the people that are around you? Do you ignore the spiritual plight of your neighbor? Do you ignore the spiritual shortcomings of your coworker? All in the name of comfort, or in the name of, I don't want to step on anyone's toes, like their life's, mine's mine. I just want to do my life and call it a day. Well, we see in this story that because Eli ignored the spiritual well-being of people under his influence, it didn't go well with him. The New American Standard Bible, the English Standard Version, and other translations of the Bible say that these boys weren't just wicked and that they didn't respect the Lord. It says that they were actually worthless. It says they were worthless people who did not know God. That's pretty harsh, they must have known God somehow. They were in the temple. They were working for God. They were living their lives in accordance with the Old Testament rite of being a priest. So how are they worthless, and how do they not know God? Well, literally, the ancient Hebrew calls them sons of Belial. Belial was a pagan god, and the phrase sons of Belial refers to worthless and wicked men. This was a significant problem because the sons of Eli were in the line to succeed him as high priest, and they already functioned in that priesthood. It's not someone you want to be going to and asking for advice about religion or spirituality. But yet, because of Eli's shortcomings, because of his dealings with his own children, they are deemed worthless men who do not know God. It's not really the legacy that I want to be leaving behind. I don't know about you, but your legacy is your problem, but I can stand up here today and ask you, like, that's not the legacy you want to leave, is it? Like, you don't want to be being the neighbor who's talked about as, oh yeah, well, you know, they knew this and they knew that, and they would talk about it for themselves all the time, but they never once said that I could be involved. It's not the legacy that I hope that we leave behind. So the author of 1 Samuel is not saying that Hophni and Phinehas lacked the factual knowledge about God. He's indicating a much worse spiritual condition. He's revealing to us that Eli's sons did not believe in the existence of God. You have people working in the church, and the Bible says they didn't even know God. Believe that He didn't even exist. Hence, probably their ease in saying, you know what? To heck with God and what belongs to Him. I'm going to take for myself, and they would dig into the pot and take all that stuff for themselves. Because they didn't care. If you don't believe the guy exists, you're not going to care in what He's going to do to you, because you don't think He's going to do anything. And we can argue, well, you know, that's Hophni and Phinehas, that's their problem. But according to the Scriptures, it's also Eli's problem, because he was their influencer. And we talked last week about owning it. We talked about the gentleman Sceva, and he was a Jewish itinerant exorcist, and he had a faith enough to do this work, but his 7 sons didn't know Jesus. They declared Paul and the Jesus whom he preached. Hophni and Phinehas could be the same way. They would look at the people coming in and be like, oh yeah, our God believes in Yahweh, yada, yada, yada. Put your gift there and let's go. Come on, hurry it up. They were so defiant in the name of God that they were actually having sexual relations with the women that would come to the temple, and Eli knew about it. And Eli refused to do anything. And so, the second problem, or the second thing that we find in the story is that not only did Eli ignore the spiritual growth of his children, he didn't teach the principles of God to his children either. And again, this is more than just your children. This is, do you know people who don't know God? Are you sharing God with them? Or are you just, well, I don't have time for that. I'd rather be over here doing this with my Christian friends, or I'd rather be over here doing that, or, you know, I got this to do, or I got that to do. When we have people we know that only know of God in certain ways, but don't actually know of God. And we could be spending time with them, teaching them God's principles, that it's the golden rule, not because that's what you heard of in school, but because that's what is actually taught in the Bible. And so we have here Hophni and Phinehas. They don't know God, and they don't respect God or His ways, so they're not afraid of robbing God. And the greed of Eli's sons was so bad that they did not hesitate to use violence and the threat of violence to get what they wanted. So we have a guy who's the high priest of Israel, because God chose the Levite family, all descended from Levi, the son of Jacob, to be priests in Israel. They're supposed to be the ones that are the most intimate with God. They're supposed to be the ones that are teaching the nation of Israel all the precepts of God. They're supposed to be the ones guiding Israel down the path of righteousness according to the Torah, for God and His name's sake. And yet, Eli's kids are more heathen than the heathens are. And they didn't care. They just kept doing it. And so eventually the people stopped bringing their sacrifices to God's house, for they feared being harassed by these kids. You imagine not wanting to come to church because the pastor is so vile and a fearmonger and one who berates you over the head with his Bible as you walk by. And it's not even that it's not even that they're preaching God in a negative way. You know, it's not like I'm standing up here and smacking you with the Bible, calling you dirty, rotten heathens because you don't pray enough, or you don't give enough, or you don't love enough, or you don't, those are things that should be preached, but they could be preached in a wrong way. These guys are so bad that they're sleeping with the women that come to worship, or the women that might work in the church. They're so bad that they're going back to the offering plate and taking the offering envelopes home with them before they're counted by the treasurer. These guys are like robbers, thieves, rapists, and they're just rotten to the core. And yet we're allowed to see this story in the Bible. Why wasn't it dealt with sooner? Why wasn't it? And I think we can read these stories and say those things, but we can also read these stories and say they're there to teach us a purpose about our legacy and how we handle people and our attitudes. Because if Eli was the mature, God-fearing high priest that he should have been, these children would have never had a place in the temple. They would have never been allowed to serve. And yet, because Eli is immature, he is weak-kneed when it comes to discipline, he's just allowing his children to run roughshod over the temple and the nation of Israel. And then finally, in the things that we can see from Eli, we see that Eli tolerates his kids' immoral behavior. There are days, I'll be honest, it's not as bad as this, but there are days when especially during summer and the weekends, there are days when it's just like, had enough, kids, have at it, because I just don't want to deal with it anymore. But there comes to a point where you have to say, like, that's it, you can't push the boundary anymore. Like, and even when it's not people of, like that aren't our kids. We see people doing certain things, and there comes a point in time where as spiritual influencers, we have to say, that's it, enough's enough. You're taking it so far that, like, you go any further, well, you've gone far enough, you go any further, and I'm leaving, because there needs to be a point where we say, we're not going to tolerate this anymore, whether they're our kids, our nieces, our nephews, maybe even our parents, our grandkids, our aunts and uncles, our neighbors, the friends we've known from high school. There has to be a point where we look in ourselves and say, God, am I willing to tolerate this stuff? Am I willing to allow it to tarnish the legacy that you want me to leave behind? Or am I going to stand up for the things that are right? Am I going to stand up for godliness and righteousness and holiness? Or am I going to allow these people to tarnish me and then tarnish your name just because I want to feel like I belong? Or I don't have the moral fortitude to stand up for what's right? Because that's what I see in Eli. Eli was high priest, and yet he had no moral fortitude to say, boys, that's it. All he does is give them this feeble rebuke. Well, boys, I've heard some things. Not good things either. And we don't know, maybe Eli's kids were like, well, Dad, come on, that lady, she's just talk. She'll talk about anything. Well, come on, you're going to trust that guy over us, Dad? Really? Like, we're a priest, and he's a lowly farmer. He'll do anything to gain some credit, right? Like, come on. Maybe they kind of coerce their dad. Hey, Dad, you know what? You're old, and we're in line, so toe the line. We don't know, that's not in the story, but what we do know is Eli gives him this, like, we've heard bad things about you, and that's not right. Like, it's one thing if you sinned against me, because then God can intercede on your behalf, but you're sinning against God. And they just look at him, yeah, so what? And he does nothing. And he had every power to do something. According to The Old Testament law in Leviticus 20 verse 10, he could have said to his children, then I'm going to hand you over to the townsfolk and let them deal with you. And you know what Leviticus 20 verse 10 says about that? The townsfolk would have taken Hophni and Phinehas outside the city limits, grabbed some big boulders, and they would have stoned them to death. That was by law, the right for the townsfolk to do. But because Eli wouldn't do anything, they were left to their evil devices. And the prophet of God that comes to Eli says, you have honored your sons more than me. You've honored your friendship more than me. You've honored your parents more than me. You've honored your work more than me. I've been running that statement over and over and over in my mind. Honored, fill in the blank, more than me. And I don't know about you, but if I die and something gets written on my tombstone, that's the last thing I want written there. He honored such and such more than God. No, thank you. That's not the legacy I want to leave. So I've been begging the question, why? Why would Eli honor his kids more than God? There's a lot of things we could put in there because he didn't have the greatest father figure in his life. Maybe he had no father in his life. Maybe his father was always too busy in the church, so he didn't know how to discipline. Maybe he got overly disciplined, so now he doesn't want to discipline at all. Maybe he had no discipline, so he doesn't know how to discipline. Maybe he's so emotionally insecure, he doesn't want to cause conflict. Or maybe he just doesn't have the nerve. Maybe he's so sheepish and shy. He's just like, You understood? Okay, good talk. There's so much we could ask Eli about why. But then I also wonder, what was wrong with your own kids that you couldn't train them, but we hear that you trained Samuel. Everything about Eli and Samuel is Samuel grew in the knowledge of the Lord. Samuel grew in wisdom with God. Samuel grew and grew and grew and grew in all these things righteous and holy. But Eli's own kids drifted and faltered and swayed and lied and cheated and stole. So where did the problem happen? Well, I don't know. I can't answer that. But what I can answer is Eli's legacy. Yeah, Samuel was a great man of God. Samuel did wondrous things. Samuel anointed the first two kings of Israel. Samuel led the nation of Israel as a judge for many years. He was a great man of faith. But if you turn to 1 Samuel chapter 8, Eli is long gone. Hophni and Phinehas are long gone. Samuel is now old in his years. Samuel has led the nation of Israel with fortitude, with faithfulness, with wisdom, with righteousness. And yet in 1 Samuel 8, 1 through 5, we read that when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judge over Israel. Okay, he's now coming into fatherhood. How is he going to handle the situation? His father wasn't around. Remember the story. Hannah gave him to the Lord. So Hannah has basically said, Eli, you're raising my son. And Elkanah is off at the house doing his own thing with his other children. So his only father figure is Eli, who seemed emotionally distant with his own kids, and Elkanah, who was, physically distant from his kid. And it says his firstborn's name was Joel, his second was Abijah. They were judge in Beersheba. So they're already in the business. They're already doing what Samuel is doing. They're not the high priest and priests like Eli and Hophni and Phinehas, but they are spiritual rulers over the nation of Israel. However, His sons did not walk in his ways. They turned toward dishonest profit, took bribes, and perverted justice. So yeah, Samuel was this great man of God, and we read stories of his goodness and his faithfulness and his awesome deeds. But the legacy that he was left by Eli is the one of, I don't know how to handle my kids. Or, I don't know how to talk to strangers about my faith. I don't know how to influence others for right living. I don't know how to talk about the golden rule when my non-religious friend brings it up. Oh, I always like to live by the golden rule, and it's a good standard. And we know, that's the Bible. Jesus taught, do unto others as you would have do unto you. But I just can't, because I don't know how. The legacy he got was not a good one. And so all the elders of Israel gather together, and they go to Samuel at Ramah, and they say to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Therefore appoint a king to judge us, the same as all the other nations have." I've read that story time and time again. And the thing I remember most about it is Samuel going back to God and crying to God, "Oh God, they rejected me." And God's like, "No, they didn't reject you, they rejected me." And how the nation of Israel turned from God because they want a king when God is their king, and they didn't recognize it. But I wonder now, why didn't they recognize it? Because legacy. Eli's legacy of poor influence over the spiritual lives of his kids led to a poor relationship with Samuel and his kids, which led to the nation of Israel not wanting them and godly people ruling over them, so they want to be now like everyone else because they don't have God in their lives, so why would it be less for us if we didn't? Because we've got men that are supposedly godly in our ruling structure, but it doesn't seem to be working out. So they have this negative experience. They've got negative legacy. And so because it is parent-dominated in our story, and it is Father's Day, I want to point out that we should not assume that parents are culpable for the poor conduct of their children. Comes a point in time where, hey, you're old enough. If you've done something bad, it's you. I tried. I taught you as best as I could. But because many righteous parents earnestly strive to teach their children from their youth the principles of the gospel, yet their children still will go astray. So it's not a parent bash. Oh, you turned out like Eli, you're such a bad parent. No, because maybe Eli did try to teach his sons the way of God, and they just went astray. It happens sometimes. So we can't always bash the parent, but we must also not downplay the crucial responsibilities that parents have to instruct their children. So I can say it this way. We have neighbors, we have friends, we have co-workers. They don't know the ways of God. So I'm not bashing you that your co-workers still don't know the ways of God, because they're adults. They can, figure it out for themselves, perhaps. Or perhaps they knew, and you're there as the one to nudge them forward, further into their faith of God. And they're just, because they're adults, they're being obstinate, and they just don't want to move. But we also have that responsibility. This two-sided coin. It's not our fault they don't, but it's our fault if we don't. And so the story I get from Eli that I can then grab hold of and go for myself is what I just said. It's not my fault if they don't, but it's my fault if I don't. We all have influence. We all have people that we need to talk to. If you talk to them and they don't, you tried. It's not your job to change somebody. It's your job to share. But if you know of people who don't and you didn't, well, then I can say it's your fault. Because you have the knowledge to share. And you should share. And then you should leave it up to God to do the work after you shared. Because what kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? There was a story I once heard. It was a minister and an atheist riding on a plane. And they got talking, and the atheist started to describe what kind of work he did for a living, and then he went to the minister and, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" And the minister was like, "Oh, good grief. Like, I know he's an atheist. He's already been very vocal about his distrust of God and blah, blah, blah." And so he said, "I work in communications." And the guy's like, "Oh, okay. Well, like, what kind of communications?" And he kept pushing the issue and kept probing for more answers. And the guy's like, "Oh, you know, fine. You know, like, I'm a priest." And the atheist looked at the guy and said, "How dare you not tell me that? You supposed to say that you have this knowledge of this God that could alter my life for the better, and it's this guaranteed fact, and you don't want to tell me about it? Well, then you must not believe what you think you do." And it was this whole like, whoa, you know, what kind of legacy are you leaving behind? One that you did everything possible so that people would know the God that you love and serve, or you did everything possible to avoid the topic? I pray and hope it's the first one, that you did everything in your power to share about the God that you love and serve. Let's pray. Father, from my point of view, sometimes the word is harder to share than others. But I always believe that it's necessary. We all have a legacy to leave. It reminds me of that song, "I don't want to leave a legacy. I don't care if they remember me. Only Jesus." Do you care if people remember you, or do you care that people remember Jesus? Father, I ask for courage, assistance in sharing you, so that those who don't know you yet would know you. And even if it's not that, I ask and pray that my life would be a reflection of Jesus more than a reflection of myself. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.